in his gospel in chapter 19, verse 36, "For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled, quote, not one of his bones will be broken." And that was because normally they would break the legs of someone who was crucified in order to expedite the process of their death in case they were still alive. But for some reason they didn't do that. They pierced his side instead to ensure he was dead, and he was already dead. But yeah, in this way, Passover looked forward to that by not breaking any one of the bones of the lamb that was offered on that night. It's really cool.
And you see that in all the Gospels.
That's pointing towards in the way that Jesus would be crucified, you know?
Mm-hmm. And obviously it's his blood that covers our sin. It's his blood that allows for us to be past the angel of death to pass over us.
Yeah.
And our children. Just saying.
That's true. Probably kids in those households in Egypt.
I mean, obviously, because they were firstborns, so...
That's true.
When he says, "This is the statute of the Passover, no foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner or hired worker may eat of it. It shall be eaten at one house. You shall not take any of the flesh outside of the house, and you shall not break any of its bones." If you are outside of God's covenant family, you have to be brought into the covenant family first in order to have the angel of death pass over you.
Yeah, you need to be God's people, part of God's people, to be covered by his love and blessings.
Right.
God's sequence of events is the same too. After Jesus' sacrifice and his blood covers us, then we are delivered from our sin. You know, the Exodus is God's big object lesson of redemption from our sin, you know? It's his big picture for all peoples to look at and see how he brings about restoration and how he brings about redemption from our sin. That we are in slavery, and then it required blood, it required death from a substitute for us to then exodus.
It's really interesting that he requires blood, the blood of the lamb too. I mean, why didn't he just say, "Go shear your lamb and put its wool above your doorstep or your doorpost"? Because
that doesn't kill a lamb.
Right.
Yeah.
He could have said, you know, "I don't want to kill this innocent animal, so just take its wool." But he didn't. He decided, because of what it was symbolizing, that the lamb needed to die, that its blood needed to be shed.
Yeah. And
they needed to consume the meat of the animal, consume it. Mm-hmm. Like George was talking about it being kind of a symbol of our communion meal. Even the Israelites eating that meat the night before they were preparing to leave Egypt, that meat nourished them throughout their journey.
We have to be united with Christ in order to be delivered from the penalty and power and presence of sin in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
As we go back to Abraham actually, when he went to make the sacrifice, what's God provide?
A ram in the thicket.
Yep.
A ram in the thicket. There was blood was required.
That's what Hebrews teaches, right? Without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, our sin has accrued a debt of death, right? It's a sentence of death is on our heads because of our sin. Death is required to pay for that. The wages of sin is death. This Passover lamb prefigures Jesus being our Passover lamb.
In 1 Corinthians, "Cleanse out the old leaven that you may be a new lump, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Let us therefore celebrate the festival, not with the old leaven, the leaven of malice and evil, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." He calls Jesus our Passover lamb. Yeah. This is not something that we're reading into or hyper-spiritualizing.
Mm-hmm.
Paul's even calling Jesus our Passover lamb.
No, we are not making this up, folks.
We're not that smart.
Well, and the hyssop branches are really interesting because they were a natural antibacterial agent and were used in washing hands and that sort of thing.
Exfoliant?
Yeah, and exfoliant, and had purifying elements to it. And what's, way before Jesus' time, about 1,000 years, David in Psalm 51, when he is realizing the severity of his sin, prays to God in verse 7, says, "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow." And I think it's super cool to see that hyssop was used in spreading the blood on the doorpost in Passover And now thinking that this blood was a type of Jesus' blood, which not only pays our penalty, but the hyssop branch also typifies the purification that happens, the expiation that happens when we're united with Christ, and when His perfect sacrifice is applied to us and substituted for us.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting as we read the Scripture, the detail of some of the things that I read that I miss, but the symbolism of all of those things, when I read God's law, there are places in the Old Testament that the law is just really difficult. But
so true.
But if I really sit and take my time going through that, you see a lot of symbolism brought forth, or understand some of the things that God did and why He did it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, God never did anything frivolously, you know? He was always trying to bring a spiritual truth to all of the material things that we do.
And in Acts 28, Paul tries to convince some of the Romans of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it says that he uses the law of Moses and the prophets. Like, he didn't have a New Testament. He had the law of Moses and he had the prophets. So when we look at things like the Passover, I'm sure he probably used, like, look, here's the Passover. Remember the Passover?
Yeah, look at the way God works.
Look at how God has worked through the Passover. Look at the symbolism here. There's so many parallels, and those are the tools that Paul used, because the gospel is shown in the Old Testament as well.
Yeah, it's the apostles were doing a lot of the time in Acts 2 was preaching the Old Testament and then testifying that it was all about Jesus, and that Jesus is the Messiah that the law and prophets were talking about. Could you imagine saying, hey, preach the gospel, but only use Old Testament verses?
Yeah, that seems impossible to us. I mean, we believe in covenant theology. Like, all of the Old Testament was speaking of Jesus, but it was just, I'll say, masked.
Yeah, revealed a little bit.
It was, further revealed in the New Testament, I guess is what you'd say. We have been taught how to share our faith predominantly from the New Testament, and that's a luxury that Paul didn't have.
Yeah.
I mean, he was still writing it.
It's true. So should we celebrate the Feast of Passover today?
What do you think, George?
Should we celebrate the Feast of Passover today? I'm going to say that I have done this on several occasions, okay? Mm-hmm. I've done that with you guys, and I've actually done this with a couple of times with a Messianic Jew actually leading it. I would encourage people to do it, but make sure that they have some sort of guide to take them through it so it's done accurately, and help us look forward. I think it actually helps me look forward to Easter. We're going to be celebrating Christ overcoming sin.
So I celebrated Passover every year growing up. My mom and dad enjoyed doing it. We also did it in a Christ-centered way. When me and Erica started doing it. When Erica and I started doing it, we ordered a Haggadah off the internet, and it was a Jewish one, but me and Erica sat down. But Erica and I sat down, as she was saying earlier, and we went through it and kind of built our own liturgy and our own way of going through it. We kept to the same structure, but added in points where we would read scriptures where Jesus fulfilled certain parts of the feast. And obviously at the end, because in Passover they still say, and next year in Jerusalem. Yeah.
Yep.
So they had this looking forward aspect to it. But when we take the Lord's Supper, which I do think is, I think Passover is kind of analogous to the Lord's Supper. Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me."
In remembrance of me.
When you do this, you're proclaiming the Lord's death until He comes. So there's even this forward-looking aspect to the Lord's Supper in the same way. So I think it's real easy for Christians to celebrate Passover and have it be a real beneficial time of celebrating Christ as our Passover lamb and looking forward to His coming.
To the New Jerusalem?
Yeah, and to the New Jerusalem. Next year in the New Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely our hope. So Paul said in 1 Corinthians 5 that Erica read, it's kind of in passing, but he says, so therefore celebrate the feast. Kind of sounds like he was assuming...
Well, he was advocating for celebrating the feast, clearly.
Mm-hmm. But in a correct manner, in a Christ-centered manner.
Mm-hmm. Paul himself was a Jew who would have celebrated Passover his whole life. And so for him to even say, coming out of Judaism and into Christianity, to say, keep celebrating this feast, he must have seen the benefit of continuing with the feast. Well, because he did say we don't have to continue with circumcision and other rituals that the Jewish faith contended for. So, but Passover was one of the things that he said to continue to do.
Yeah, Jesus did. Jesus celebrated Passover with his disciples when he instituted the Lord's Supper. Matthew 26.
Yeah.
The disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover.
So obviously there's nothing wrong with celebrating it.
Right.
So you're not sinning by celebrating it.
And I don't think you're sinning by not celebrating it. I just think that you're missing out on something super awesome that could be beneficial.
I would never say that you're sinning by doing it.
Some people get crazy about doing Jewish stuff, though.
But the first time that I did it, when we have done it, for me, it really helps me to look forward to Easter. It really does.
Well, because it's like connecting a puzzle almost, you know?
Yeah.
It's like you have these pieces over here and these pieces over here. And Passover, if done in a Christ-centered way, which I hope we accomplish every year, it really does connect those pieces and it puts together a puzzle to where for someone who, like me, is very visual and likes to see things to get it, to understand it, it's very helpful.
Someday, we are going to celebrate this with Jesus.
Yep, the marriage feast of the Lamb. We're going to have a meal with our Passover lamb.
Can you imagine what that day will be like?
I can only imagine.
Now playing in theaters everywhere.
Just kidding, we haven't seen the movie, so we're not bashing it. Or
advocating it. That's the other benefit of getting an emphasis on Passover is the theological significance of substitutionary atonement.
That's true.
Yeah.
That definitely is a really good picture of substitutionary atonement.
That doctrine is attacked, I think, like every century by some group of people. The doctrine of substitutionary atonement is rooted in the story of Passover.
Well, and Jesus says that he's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world.
Right.
So he's the Passover lamb who covers our sin, you know?
And even the idea of propitiating wrath. Wrath was diverted because the blood and the purification from the hyssop expiated our sin. It took away what was wrathful. So the way God's wrath was diverted.
We always want to say, this is probably an American way of thinking too, but like slavery is wrong. And we know it is wrong, right? But we naturally feel like we want to vindicate the slave. It's like a very American thing. And it's a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
Right.
But in this story, although the Jews were slaves and God did not want his people to be slaves, did the Jews deserve anything more than slavery? Besides being God's chosen people and him having a plan for them.
Yeah.
Did they deserve anything? They were still sinners. They were still in rebellion against God. They still were...
It's true. They didn't have any moral high ground to pull on the Egyptians.
It wasn't like they were perfect people who were just held against their will. I mean, they were still sinners.
Right.
They were still depraved. They still, like I said, were in rebellion against God. And God still had mercy on them. And outside of them just being his chosen people... They had nothing else going for them. There's no other reason outside of God just choosing to spare them that he did.
That's exactly what Paul echoes in Romans 9 with the Exodus story and the story of the Israelites when they built the golden calf was, I'll have mercy on whom I have mercy. And I will harden who I will harden. We don't deserve God's favor. We haven't done anything to earn it. And in fact, we are ill-deserved. We have done everything in our power to not earn it. So yeah, that's a good point.
Gerhardus Voss.
Hey, what? What nationality is Gerhardus Voss?
I don't know. I try and ignore that.
Come on.
Okay.
He's Dutch. Go on, George.
Voss is Dutch and Grant happens to be Dutch, okay?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Okay, go ahead.
Van Brimmer doesn't sound very Dutch to me.
So this is from Voss's book, Biblical Theology of the New Testament. A According to the account, the blood put on the houses was not a mere signal by which the dwellings of the Hebrews could be recognized. It may have been this too, but its real efficacy was derived from its sacrificial character.